Hi, Ali. So, are you ready for the 9th episode of Tech Life Skills with Tanmay in 20 minutes?
Good morning, Tanmay. I'm ready as I ever will be. Cannot think of a better way to spend my Sunday morning, but with you and your audience. So this will be a fun exchange.
Thank you very much. Would you like to say hi to our viewers?
Absolutely. So good morning, everybody. My name is Ali. I teach and work at Durham College, and I'm looking forward to discussing with Tanmay in the next 20 minutes the role of natural languages in developing your technology skills. Not everybody talks about the idea of how does knowing more than one language, and I mean English or French or Spanish, impact your ability to engage in the tech world and produce better technologies. Looking forward to seeing you in the next 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ali. Hi, Ali. So, are you ready for the 9th episode of Tech Life Skills with Tanmay in 20 minutes?
Good morning, Tanmay. I'm ready as I ever will be. Cannot think of a better way to spend my Sunday morning, but with you and your audience. So this will be a fun exchange.
Thank you very much. Would you like to say hi to our viewers?
Absolutely. So good morning, everybody. My name is Ali. I teach and work at Durham College, and I'm looking forward to discussing with Tanmay in the next 20 minutes the role of natural languages in developing your technology skills. Not everybody talks about the idea.
Hello and welcome everybody to the 9th episode of Tech Life Skills with Tanmay. I hope you're all keeping well. Thank you very much for joining today's live stream. Hope you're keeping safe. And for the past couple of years, as I've been going to different educational institutions across the globe, and I've been giving talks and conducting workshops, there's a couple things that I've noticed. Now, I've interacted with teachers and students from a variety of different backgrounds, all sorts of demographics, and I've seen a very wide diversity of methods that are actually used to teach these students. And as I saw all these different methods, it really sparked the question in my mind, is there really a right way of teaching technology? And if so, what are those critical guidelines that you need to follow? And what really distinguishes a successful training from one that doesn't really instill that curiosity, right? So those are the questions that are in my mind. And I know personally from the questions and from the thoughts that I receive in all sorts of media that everybody, and this is regardless of age or even professional background, wants to get into technology in at least some form or fashion. And that's why I believe today's discussion is really going to be particularly exciting and valuable for everybody that's watching the stream. Now, in this discussion, we're going to be getting the kind of insights that really you would only expect from a seasoned professional. And so that's why I'm very glad to welcome today's special guest. His name is Ali Hirji. Now, Ali and I first met at the Enable AI Summit at Durham College while I was there for my keynote. And actually, something I want to share quickly is one of my favorite gifts that I got from the Durham College while I was there for the keynote. Now, this I want you to if you can guess what this is actually for, this rubber ducky in the chat, that would be great. I'm pretty sure some of you, if you're into development or programming, you would know what this is for, right? So this is just a rubber ducky. What do you use this for? Of course, I got this while I was at the Enable AI Summit. And this is called, of course it's a rubber duck, but you use this for debugging because as a developer, it can be helpful to actually explain your code or explain your logic to somebody else to try and debug your code. And so this is rubber ducky debugging, and it's a pretty fascinating concept. And so there are all sorts of wonderful experiences I've had with Ali. Now, Ali is actually currently completing his PhD in communications. And I know what you're probably thinking. What does communications have to do with this? Well, all I can really say is I'm sure that my friend Ali is really going to wow you with his thoughts in that space. And so Ali is also the project manager at the AI Hub and the lead of the Center for Cyber Innovation at Durham College. And now, without any further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Ali. Hi, Ali. How are you? Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining in. And before we begin our discussion, could I please request you to introduce yourself?
Sure. So thanks for that lovely introduction, Tanmay. So as you had mentioned, my name is Ali. And the one thing that I want to introduce myself with is by talking about this aspect of for me, what I learn in the classroom is not what I deliver through curriculum. It's what I learn from my students. It's what I learn from my engagements in the class. And that's where I've developed this keen interest in seeing what are those so-called soft skills and what are those so-called natural language skills that you need in order to be proficient in the world of technology. So I'm looking today to really discuss three things. If you know more than one language, how does that impact you in the world of technology? If you come from a different country to Canada, how does that situate you in AI development and cyber security development and whatever else have you? And more importantly than that, what can we learn from these exchanges that we have with international students, with immigrants into Canada? What can we learn that is of importance to our technology fabric? I say this all the time to my students: get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and this episode is not going to be any different.
That is absolutely wonderful. I cannot wait to get uncomfortable. This is going to be great. So now I want to start off with by taking a little bit of a step back. And I mean, I know for the past couple of years I've been absolutely fascinated by the field of language. And the reason I say that is because language really has so many more impacts than you see on the surface. Right? Like, you think language is just the way that we communicate, but there's so much more to that. Language, in a way, not only is a result of the way that our brains are structured, but language itself has an impact on the way our brains are structured as well. And even apart from that, knowing multiple languages, I mean, as you mentioned and as you're going to sort of delve into deeper, provides you kinds of abilities that, again, you don't notice on surface level. And so what I wanted to do is sort of get your thoughts on what initially interested you on taking a look at that intersection between language and tech skills. What fascinated you about that?
Absolutely. So let's begin by taking a bit of a back step. The first thing that I want to attack as a concept is the idea of language itself. Mm-hmm. Often we stay rooted in this idea that language refers to English, Spanish, or Urdu, or Hindi, whatever else have you. I want to take a back step and go to two polars on how I understand language. Language is best understood if you define it from the perspective of there is a speaking component and there's a written component to it. Mm-hmm. And everybody has a varied sense of where they stand in both speaking a language and writing a language, or talking about a language, or thinking through in a language. So now take those two polars and transport yourself into the lens of where you first started learning language, and take to that moment when a child is born. The child is not necessarily learning a structured language per se, but the child is learning a way to communicate. The child is learning a way in which it can perceive what it's experiencing and relay that to someone, be it the parent, be it somebody around them, whether it's a scream, whether it's a smile, whether it's tears. There's a way in which that particular child is learning to communicate with the person with them. Now take that a little more deeper, and you'll immediately begin to understand that right over there, you're getting your first experience and lesson in the importance of UX and UI, the importance of experience. How much exposure somebody has to someone ultimately makes them comfortable with that someone. That then should be at the primary focus of all tech development, is that at the very root of our communications, at the very root of our formulated languages is the idea of familiarity. Mm-hmm. This is why I always tell my students that when you're developing an interface, you're developing a website via which you then are going to receive information and data, and then you're going to run, for example, a recommendation system. Mm-hmm. Familiarity is one of the key components that I impose upon them. In fact, I superimpose upon them. Yes, we always talk about this idea of let's think outside of the box, let's burn the box. But change is the only constant. I get it. But there are certain areas where familiarity is important. That's why I always go back and I look to that primary moment when we began our communications as children, mm-hmm. and how we began to communicate with familiar faces. The minute you take that idea of familiarity and put that into your DevOps, you're now thinking from the lens of who am I speaking to and how do I want to make them comfortable with engaging on my platform. That's the moment when I realized that language is so important to the world of technology, because it influences how you start is how you're going to continue and how you're going to build that relationship with that client and with that community.
That is really exciting to hear about. And I mean, this sort of ties into what I was talking about in the sense that because you're learning to communicate, because you're learning to interface with other people, that really affects even the way that you think, the way that your brain is structured, the way that you act. I feel like two really fascinating examples that I love to share would be like, for example, let's just say you take a child that's learned, English as their first language versus a child that learned Russian. And if you go ahead and show them two shades of the color blue, the one that learned Russian can actually distinguish between more similar shades of the color blue because there are just more words for blue in Russian. Right? That's physically changing the way their brain perceives the environment. And it's a very well-known phenomenon that, people who are multilingual, when they speak in different languages, will often speak with different, attitudes or I guess, for lack of a better word, personalities in every language, because that's just how they learned every language. That's how each language is affecting their brain. And so it's really interesting to see what kind of impact that can have on the tech world. And it's really interesting to see sort of what you've already shared. And so that I understand why you got interested in this entire sort of field. But now what I'm wondering is, what are some of those skills that folks that are multilingual actually bring to the tech sector? What are those skills?
Great question, Tanmay. And Tanmay, I was just looking at some of the comments. I'm hoping that my audio is not echoing as much right now. If I am, Tanmay, just flag it for me and I'll make sure that I maybe bring my volume down just a little bit. So sorry if I was echoing a little there. So let's again unpack this concept of skills that somebody who is bilingual or multilingual brings to the table. Now, I know we have an audience from Dubai, from India, from all over North America. We've got a lot of people listening to us. And I want to take you on a bit of a journey for the next 2 minutes to emphasize the importance of what that multilingual or bilingual individual brings when they come to an academic institution in Canada or when they come to start working at a particular firm in the North American or Canadian context. The first thing I want to draw your attention is to a lot of people like to learn, but they don't like to be taught. And you need to understand this concept very, very clearly. And I don't mean to be philosophical, but I mean to be very pragmatic when I bring this up. Folks who have learned in different languages, who have conversed in different languages, when they come to the Canadian context or when they come to the North American context, they're taught to think in a different way. They're taught to speak in a different way. And I want us to start to erase that kind of composure. We need to start thinking about how is it that these folks learn, how is it that they thrive, and how can we both mutually benefit from that? What do I mean by this? Often I'm bilingual myself, and I dare say even multilingual. Often I find myself, but also my students, if I'm doing a presentation for them or they're doing a presentation for me, and I ask them to start thinking aloud, often I will notice that they start thinking in their local language. Some cases I hear French, in some cases I hear Spanish, in some cases I hear Hindi, I hear Punjabi, and I always wonder to myself, why is that the case? And I believe that there are 3 reasons that people, when they think in a different way, they can bring something different to the table. Number one, when you're thinking in your local language or something that you have grown up thinking through, you think of scenarios a little differently. Mm-hmm. You go back to examples, you go back to memory. Language is rooted in memory. Mm-hmm. How many times I have found myself when I teach somebody about the difference between prescriptive programming and AI, previously you would tell computers what to do. Today, computers look at lots of data and then give you the best answer. I always go back to the example which I had when I was growing up with my mom. When we saw that the oven was red, you wouldn't touch it. And then eventually I'd go back to, but then I learned in life that not everything that's red is hot. Mm-hmm. So I can touch other things that's red, like the handle of my cricket bat, which had the rubber elastic on it, was red. Language is rooted in memory. And a lot of times these students and these professionals who come, they come up with some of the best examples to explain something when they go back in memory. Mm-hmm. So that's number one. Number two is language. When you think about it, language and going back to whatever language you speak allows you to now think about community, allows you to think about ways in which you address situations. You see, in different languages, people talk to people differently. People address situations differently. I'll give you another example. When I came to Canada in 2007 or whenever it was, one of the biggest shocks for me was that, and I don't just mean this as a slight against Canadian culture per se. One of the biggest slights for me was when the professor walked into the classroom. Back in Dubai, we would all stand up, and there was a mutual greeting that happened. Here, that's not necessarily the case. People acknowledge the professor's existence, and then the lesson continues. For me, this skill and this ability to acknowledge a situation, to acknowledge communication protocols, is another great tech skill that we can bring to the table. Because this is how you learn to build structure. I talk about this all the time. One of the biggest reasons that DevOps teams fail is because communication structures are not followed. It's not to say that Tanmay is more superior than somebody else or Ali is less superior than somebody else. It's about knowing who does what and does it the best. And number 3 is that when you think in language, I always talk to my students about this, is that please don't come to me with different solutions without talking to me about the problem. Identify the problem first, clarify the problem from every possible angle, then let's talk about the solution. When you bring linguistic diversity into the equation, you can look at things from a 360 perspective, and that is essential. Why? Another example that I'll give you. Let's suppose you have a car, and I'm sure you've heard of this example in different ways, or this metaphor in different ways. Let's suppose you have a car, and it's not starting. You've gone to 20 mechanics, and all 20 have spent 5 hours at your house. They're not able to get it to start, and they charge you $200 for their time. Then somebody told you, call Tanmay. And Tanmay comes, and within 5 minutes fixes the car, and then sends you an invoice for $1,000. And when you ask Tanmay, hey Tanmay, you were only here for 5 minutes, why did you charge me $1,000? Tanmay will say, well, I charge you $1 for fixing it, but $999 for knowing what the problem is. And that comes with good with more language at the table, more experience at the table. And I really want to encourage that. I hope that helped them, man.
That really helped. It's fascinating to see all these different examples of how this cognitive diversity that language enables is really making it so that we can take a look at problems from more perspectives to enable more solutions. I feel like this also sort of ties back into the reason that diversity is so important within any field, but specifically within technology, because technology is about solving problems, right? Technology and development in general, like what do developers do? We are responsible for writing code that ends up solving problems that humans face. These are all sorts of problems. They can be of all sorts of magnitudes. They can be of all sorts of, issues. It doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're taking humans and we're augmenting their skills. Now, the thing is,
Correct.
These skills can only be augmented if there's a problem that we face that we need to solve. And how do we solve a problem? Well, the most effective way to solve a problem is to look at it from as many different sort of viewpoints, from as many angles as possible, to understand that problem inside and out, to then see where technology can be applied within it to help humans. And I feel like, again, as I was saying, it ties back into that diversity. Why do we not want to just get, graduates from top universities, right, like Stanford and MIT? Because what's happening is we want a wide variety of people to think in different ways, to take a look at a problem from different perspectives, so that we don't all fail at the exact same moments, right? Why do we want as many, diversity in other senses as well? It's because we want people to think differently from their own cultural and linguistic backgrounds. As a matter of fact, I want to take a look actually at a problem that we're facing today. Of course, that is the coronavirus. That's sort of the major problem that everybody's facing today. It's one of the first problems that we all have to face together internationally, regardless of where you are on the globe. This is a problem that we're facing. And so what I'm wondering is, have you seen any examples of how this multicultural sort of aspect, how this ethnic fabric has really helped us in our search for innovative solutions for COVID? How has that helped?
Great question, Tanmay. So let's again dissect this from two perspectives. There's the angle of when you look at the coronavirus and you look at how we've approached solutions for the coronavirus, how have I seen international students or folks who are bilingual or multilingual, how have I seen them respond to things? The other side is that what has the coronavirus revealed to me about certain aspects of our language when it comes to coding? I'll take the latter first. I remember reading this article, I don't quite remember where, but the ethos of it was, this writer just said, I hate computers because they only give me answers. They just tell me this is the answer, and I'll go and take it and deal with it. And while I can unpack that, at various levels from a sociological and a philosophical perspective as well, I want to look at one thing there, and that is, when we teach certain languages of programming, whether it's Python, whether it's JavaScript, whatever those languages are, it's very important for us to know that these languages don't operate in a vacuum. It's an English form of JavaScript. It's an English form of Python. There are other languages that also allow you to code with respect to your particular linguistic preference. So number one is that this exposed me to some of the realities, because as you're looking for solutions and you're talking to different people from different countries, etc., what they're telling you and what you're trying to visualize or materialize in code can sometimes be two different things. And then you realize the barrier is, I'm sort of rooted in just English. I get it. English is the traditional language of commerce. It is the language that has sort of flattened the world, so to speak. But I do believe in the aspect of that there is room for more innovation when you bring in new linguistic approaches to understanding code. It gives you new lines to write, it gives you new perspectives to take into account, and more than anything, it allows you to do comparative analysis of how one speaker of a language is writing code versus another. It's not just a rich academic area, it's a rich technological area to look at what those nuances are. And I think we need to encourage more of that. I am not just talking about let's just translate code from one language to the other. I'm talking about facilitating exchanges where you have two teams speaking different languages going at one particular problem, see the solution that they come up with. Now, with regards to the coronavirus, I would argue that there are two main things that I'm seeing how language is impacting how a lot of my friends who speak different languages, how they approach technology development. For a start, you're noticing them is that, yes, a lot of them will relate back to their own personal experiences of how problems that they had faced back home or wherever it was, how they resolved and how they solutioned it. But I'll tell you about one of the main things that I see different in a lot of them is number one is that their understanding of consumer needs, their understanding of how when you create a product or when you create a solution to fit a particular problem, in this case the coronavirus, everyone understands consumer needs differently. When it comes to a lot of, when I work with a lot of local folks, they tend to think of it in a very sort of a standard singular environment that everybody wants some way in which they can do X. But folks who come from different experiences and different language backgrounds start relating to other ideas as well. What about the aspect of age? What about the aspects of gender? What about the aspects of access? And it doesn't just impact someone, let's say, from France talking to me about French perspectives of the French community. You see this with folks who come from indigenous communities as well. They start bringing up other realities. This is why, I give mad props to people like Cybera out in Calgary, who are the local regional, education network from a telecoms perspective, but they're constantly pressing home this idea of rural connectivity and access for our indigenous and rural and remote communities to such technologies. So the first thing that you see is people who speak different languages and now thinking about user experiences from different lenses, not just globally, but within Canada itself. Mm-hmm. And number two, which I hold very important to my heart, is that when you have folks who are able to talk in different languages, you have folks who are able to now take into account other realities. They're able to look at ground realities from other communities. They're able to draw from literature reviews taken from other areas. It's very different when you translate a news report or you translate a blog post from one language into English directly. If you can take in what has been said by the writer or by the reporter or by whoever from the ground in another community, you think about it differently. And that for me is super essential. So when I see folks, for example, who come from the European communities and some folks who talk to me about what's been happening in Germany or what's been happening in New Zealand, where yes, I know English may be the predominant language, there are different realities about remote and rural communities, which I feel they bring to the table. Now, how does this translate into the development work itself? Well, for one, it speaks to the equity of your development work. Technology, if it doesn't create access for all, for me, and this is a personal stance that I take, is fundamentally biased then if it doesn't take into account how can we make access equitable. Mm-hmm. I hope that helped, doesn't it?
That really does help. As a matter of fact, I want to take a little bit of a side note there before we come back to our main topic. And that side note is you mentioned that one of the main advantages of having a wide variety of linguistic sort of backgrounds is that we're able to get people to draw from different literature, from different culture, in order to take a look at the kinds of, in a way, meta problems, problems that surround a problem, problems that sound a solution to a problem, right? Like, for example, access to the internet is a huge thing that we're seeing today. All education really is happening online now, and not having access to the internet is really becoming even more of a problem than it was just a few months ago. And so now, if you want to be educated or if you want to go to school at all, you have to have access to the internet. So I understand that having a different sort of linguistic background can help with that, with being able to draw on knowledge from different cultures. But my question for you is, do you feel like at that point we could summarize this to it's important to have diversity from different cultural backgrounds, or what specifically is the impact of language on that? What does linguistic diversity offer in terms of tech skills versus cultural diversity?
Fantastic question again, Tanmay. So without going too much into the science of how linguists understand the function of language on our brain, let's go a little deeper into that neuroscience piece of it, okay? Now, of course, I am no neuroscientist, but looking at the literature, you can tell that while there is some lateralization in how our brains function, there are certain areas of our brains that are more active for certain functions. Now, again, without delving too deep into that, the one thing you will notice is that a lot of literature that's out there will tell you that folks who are bilingual or multilingual, certain centers of the brain are more active than the other. With age, you tend to see a bit of normalization there, but language inspires and impacts your brain differently. Again, let's take a very simple example, okay? Not rooted in technology, but we will parlay this into the world of technology. I come from traditionally I am from the South Asian subcontinent. I grew up in Dubai and whatever else have you. And I had a very deep interest in philosophy and poetry. Often you would see some of the best poetry, some of the best philosophy that was coming out of our communities were definitely English speakers, very strong English speakers, but the impact of their poetry and philosophy was more so seen in Farsi or in Urdu or in Hindi. It inspires a different level of imagination. Our ability to work with technology in those binaries of 0+1, ultimately the fun comes in when you impact creativity and you bring imagination to the table, the what if moment. Mm-hmm. And I think our technology community has a lot to learn from how our ways of speaking impact our levels of imagination. This is why, if you look at the way technology is produced or where different countries have gained an edge from a technology standpoint, you will see that certain countries have a certain signature about them in terms of what they produce. Estonia, very rooted in the smart cities, smart communities, and smart governance area. The ability to make technology translate into almost every level and strata of society. You look at the communities in China, for example, very driven by I wouldn't necessarily call it by a business ethos, but very driven by a utility-like economy, where you are able to solve problems quick, but more importantly, cheaper, and even more importantly, at scale. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at Indian community and you look at the technologies that are developed there, the technologies that are developed are definitely driven by this ethos of not only can we make it quick and scale, but also from a perspective of how do you support and teach about that technology. You know, a lot of people look at customer service and say, oh, it's just cheaper to get it outsourced from India or the Philippines. But I want you to go into the psychology of those languages that they speak and how those languages have a root in them of a service culture, have a root in them of making sure that when somebody asks you a question, you dissect that question and answer it in a particular way. This is why I go back to that example of when the teacher walks in back in Dubai and we would all stand up. You know, I'm not talking about a guru shiksha-like model here. I'm not trying to say that the teacher is omnipotent. But what I'm trying to say is that teaching and sharing almost comes as service. And when that gets embedded into your language, it impacts the way you help customers use a particular use a particular tool or use a particular technology. So for me, those tech skills, we need to go back to how does this language impact our brain? What centers of our brain does does it activate, and how does that parlay into our development of technology? And I'll close by saying this. You know, books don't need batteries, okay? Our imagination doesn't need batteries either. And when you imagine how far language has taken us, I would say that if we start to delve deeper into it, we can see much more of its marvels if we engage with it deeper.
Wow, that is it's really all I can say is that it's fascinating to see that example, and the reason I say that is because you're absolutely right in the sense that the kind of impact, the kind of centers in our brain that language really lights up, and the kinds of differences within languages that cause it to light up different centers of our brain, if you look at it, really have an impact on the kind of tech skills that different cultures and different languages and different people that know those languages really bring to the table. And I feel like when you start looking at it with that lens, you start to see that so well. I mean, you mentioned, for example, India and Dubai, and you mentioned the economy with China versus, you know, people who speak English. I feel like, yeah, you can actually start to see the impact that has. I mean, if you think about language, at the end of the day, it's about representing mental states in a way that other humans can understand them and decode them and get what it is that you're thinking about. And when you have multiple different ways of being able to represent that same imaginative idea or concept, that's really just making your brain even further more generic. And when you specialize in a certain language, you know, you're able to specialize the way you think. So that really is really thoughtful. And I want to sort of bring this back to the tech curriculum. Now, I can tell, based off of what you're saying, that you're supportive of changing that curriculum for the better. You know, working towards that right way of teaching technology. And I've seen all sorts of ways that people have taught technology across the globe. Right? I've seen, you know, high schools in Winnipeg, where even, you know, I wouldn't even say just Winnipeg, even just generally, you know, for example, at the high school level, when we're teaching coding, I've seen generally that, you know, teachers or educators themselves aren't particularly engrossed or aware of the world of technology, and they're kind of learning with the students, versus, you know, in higher education, where it's very structured and rigid. So what do you think those changes should be within the curriculum, within how we teach technology, to enable a couple of things? First of all, more personalized learning, right? Being able to learn at a more individual level, because, I mean, as you mentioned, everybody learns differently. Not only is it genetic, it's even according to your language. Everybody thinks differently. How can we enable that more personalized learning? Is that important? But also at the same time, how can we start to leverage all these sorts of concepts that we usually don't think about, right? Like language. Before you mentioned this, I'm sure the vast majority of people watching the stream never related language to learning technology. So how can we take all these little seemingly unrelated separate fields and string them together into this field of education to teach technology the right way? What do you think the best way is to go about doing that?
Yeah, great question again, Tanmay. Thank you for structuring the conversation in such a method. I think, you know, you've helped me whenever I do these kind of things. I like to take people on a bit of a journey, and you've helped us sort of, you know, enter this plane and then taxi very, very neatly, and then take off into some turbulent areas. And now, as we sort of pause it for landing, you know, you structured very well. So thank you for doing this. Tanmay, look, you know, in being at York University, Durham College, Ryerson, whatever else have you, you know, when we started this discussion about you and I wanting to do this session, I told you, don't call me your mentor. Yeah, I said, call me a fellow learner. And I did that very, not just from a philosophical standpoint and a spiritual standpoint, I did it from a standpoint of teaching pedagogy. And let me tell you this. I often get this question about what's the most successful way to teach technology. I don't have the key to that. But I can tell you one thing, is that the key to success, while I don't have that, the key to failure is trying to please everyone, okay? You're not going to be able to please everyone. But I always ask whenever I teach in the classroom, whether it's intro to AI, AI in ethics, AI in business, I start off with a fundamental principle of let's go back to the curriculum. And day one, now, of course, I'm teaching at the graduate level, so it's a little bit different for me. But what I do is I always take my first class as an opportunity to get my students to talk to me about the curriculum. I always discuss that with them. And I think the first thing that we need to be doing is to realize that curriculums are not set in stone. If anything, To quote Darren Graham, who was my ex-boss at Orion and now leads the UFT AI labs or something like that, innovation, curriculum, etc., is set in jello. It's not set in stone. We should be prepared to move in different ways. Now, from a practical standpoint, what changes would I like to see? For one, and I'm sure everybody has caught on to this, I fundamentally disagree with the idea of superimposing one uniform language for communication. I do believe that we should, as part of our traditional approaches, especially to international students, is we should welcome the idea that they speak different languages and allow those languages, not just pay lip service to it, allow those languages to realize themselves through our curriculum. Whether it is by the types of guest speakers we bring, whether it is by the professor's own ability to engage in those languages, whatever that may be, the first concept for me is make those languages feel welcome and not just pay lip service to this. And I'll take 10 more seconds to emphasize this. You said it brilliantly, that we are in very different political times as well, from Black Lives Matters to, racialized sort of anti-Black racism and racialization realizing itself in our police activities, etc. It is fundamentally important that in one of the drivers of our economy, which is tech, that we respect the fact that there is a need for change, number one. Number two, I get this question all the time, and I know a couple of my students are on right now. I always, for example, at York University, if you're studying a technology-based degree, you'll be asked to do something in the humanities. You'll be asked to do something in a different field. I highly recommend we don't make this into, all right, here's a bunch of humanities, pick one and go knock yourself socks out with it, and find a bird course and get through with it. There has to be some thinking around that. One of the courses that I did during my undergraduate career was on technology and society. And the professor's name, passes my mind. I guess that's a sign of age. But one of the things that I will tell you about that professor is that he was so smart in his approach to teaching us about technology. And he would always talk to us about how this course gets us to teach other people about products that we are creating. We need to be using those additional courses, those additional humanities and social sciences in a more productive way. If there's anything that this pandemic has taught me, and I'm borrowing from a talk that I heard with 1855 Whitby earlier this week, if there's anything we've learned, and I learned from the cyber exchange as well, is that at this time when we're relying so much on technology, the arts, music, dance has an even more important value for us. People need to have that creative engines sort of pumped up all the time. And I think we need to think very carefully about those other things. And the third aspect that I will bring to mind is that we need to start teaching about technology, not from a perspective of it works in a vacuum. Wow, you just created a website that now has a recommender system. I am a big fan of constantly bringing industry and societal problems to the table and showing someone how that little Python library that you have now mastered, in it lies the key to potentially solving a lot of problems. It is the quintessential challenge of knowledge translation. If we can show even more clearer how our technology skills solve problems and advance humanity with practical examples, we would have gone a long way. All sounds simple, Tanmay, but remember something, all of this requires time and dedication. All of this requires someone who says, I get paid for 4 hours to teach, but you know what, I'm going to put in that extra hour or two. It has to come from within. And I know I'm asking for something outside of the fine print, but that is what I believe is where you're going to see the change much quicker than we can in terms of getting any administrative level of changes.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, what you mentioned around having a curriculum set in jello, not set in stone, that particularly sort of stands out to me because that makes a lot of sense in the sense that we're not saying that everything needs to be taught completely dynamically, right? That's not the point. What we're saying is that while there is a structure that exists, it's moldable, it's flexible, it's something that can change according to students, according to languages, according to communities. It's something that is not, it's not rigid, right? And that's the whole point of having, that's sort of what I believe is the next generation of education, is that sort of more flexible version of the kind of education that we have today. And I have a question for you, and I mean, there are lots of very amazing ideas that you have here, but Are there any examples of countries or even educational institutions that have already got this right? What are some examples of people who are doing amazingly on this journey towards the right way of teaching technology, in your opinion? And what are they doing, and how can they improve?
Okay. So, I'll take this from two angles for the next 2 minutes, right? And, a friend of mine once said is, I won't be fascinated with technology until I'm able to download food. And what he meant by that was this idea of, look, technology is all fascinating, but it's the human being that I'm more fascinated with. It's creation that I'm more fascinated with. It's our interactions with each other and the environment that I'm more fascinated with. And I want to take that canvas to give you two examples in the world that I have seen where I believe that technology learning and technology training is something that we should adopt and we should look at. Number one is, I know a lot of people talk about this idea of Estonia, right? And Estonia is smart cities and smart communities, so on and so forth. But I want to go to the Inuit communities in Ontario, specifically. Well, not in Ontario, but in Canada. I've spent quite a bit of time in Nunavut, and I had the pleasure of working with my supervisor, Dr. Anna Hudson, on certain aspects of Inuit culture and mobilizing Inuit culture and the challenges that are faced from a technology perspective. I say this to my students all the time, is that while I won't tell you that this institution's got it right, I'll point you to examples that are on the right path, okay? Because I have no answers, I have questions and more questions, okay? Which gets us on a journey. Why I bring up the example of the Inuit communities is twofold. Number one is, whenever my students ask me, I want to study, you're seeing a lot of questions also, people saying I'm an Azure architect and I want to go into AI, blah, blah, blah. I want to become AI this. Great questions, for sure. But I always tell my students that if you're going to get into this field, for me, you have one skill. And that skill is that you are a problem solver. Nothing but. You are a problem solver. So I take this and I look at the Inuit communities in Nunavut, and they have mastered the art of storytelling. Whether it is through orality, whether it's through art, whether it's through images, whether it's through actual, products that they develop, so, certain sweaters or materials, etc. They've mastered the art of storytelling, and they've parlayed that in their generation. They're able to maintain their history through orality, through even a lack of technology, lack of internet access, so on and so forth. The historical sense is very, very strong. What I like about those communities is the ability to take what they have known, build on it, but not forget where they started from. This is why I talk about these are communities that know that you need to know the basics and know the roots very well if you're going to germinate something powerful and something new. So the first example I always go to is the traditional learning models that you see in Inuit communities, all right? And I implore people to look at it, talk to your elders in your communities. In Ontario, for example, we have reserves where we have elders who you can converse with through Contact North, you can converse with through different learning programs. Talk to them. Look at the learning systems they have in place. Number two, an example which I'm sure a lot of people may disagree with me on, but I'm going to bring it up nonetheless. So you know very well, you follow me on social media, about a week ago, a scholar that I admired a great deal passed away. Someone whose oratory skills, someone whose literary skills impacted me, not just from a technology perspective, but from a perspective of how you get your point across. And there was something that he would talk to us about this idea. So he did his schooling in different seminaries in the Middle East, and he would talk about this aspect of, we were always taught that any subject should be looked at from 5 perspectives, okay? And I really love this. Now, this may come from the roots of Middle Eastern civilization. I don't know. I can research it some more. But it talks about when you teach a subject, there are 5 aspects about that subject. Number 1 is, how do you debate that subject? Number 2, how do you test that subject? Number 3, how do you change that subject? Number 4, how do you implement that particular subject? And number 5, how do you continue to add to the corpus of knowledge that exists about that particular subject? And if you follow these 5 steps, you then begin to realize that whatever we are learning in technology, when we're teaching skills in Python, or we're teaching skills in JavaScript, or we're teaching even just how do you manage Azure environments or AWS environments, you have to make sure that not only can we converse about these, we can talk intelligently about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. More importantly than that, we can intelligently speak to somebody else and guide them on the usage of those environments. Number 4, we know the extent of what we know and know where the gaps are. And number 5, we know how we can go about to make changes or how we can do better. So that speaks to open source communities as well as closed communities. This speaks to how companies approach R&D towards our philosophies on funding of R&D. This speaks to how different tech giants can speak to one another. And number 4 and number 5 all speak to if you're able to create an environment where we can all talk, discuss, debate, and make changes collectively, that helps a nation state move forward. That is what I also see in Estonia and why I believe their smart cities movement has been so good, because I correct myself here, they never called it smart cities, they call it smart communities. Because smartness or technology is not rooted in the idea of the metropolis, it's rooted in everyone. So smart communities includes the rural communities, indigenous communities, the impoverished communities, and whatever else have you. It's equitable and everybody can talk about it.
That is, I mean, first of all, debate, test, change, implement, and add into that corpus of knowledge. That is really insightful. And I feel like you're right. When we keep that kind of thing in mind, and when we follow that, we can really achieve things that so far that seemed sort of out of focus. That seemed out of grasp. What you mentioned around Estonia having these sorts of smart communities and not just smart cities, again, that makes so much sense, because at the end of the day, it's about the community working together, coming together, collaborating. That's what makes humans special, right? It's the fact that we have these complex societies that enable us to work with one another in such an efficient way that we can achieve more than any other animal on the planet, right? What separates us from other primates is the fact that we can communicate, is the fact that we have this general purpose intelligence that enables us to work together, right? You put a single human in the wild, probably wouldn't last that long. But you put a community of people in the wild, and suddenly they're thriving, and we've built modern society, right? So you're absolutely right. It's about those communities. It's about working together, because that is exactly what separates us from humans. Now, before we get to the live chat, there is a question that I've got for you, and this was from a little while ago when you were speaking. And the question is, you mentioned that, of course, we were talking about the importance of different communities, different cultures, different languages, and sort of the tech skills that they can bring to the table. And I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on, specifically at the Durham College. I know there's quite a few different international students from all sorts of regions across the globe. How has that impacted the community at the Durham College? And what are the advantages of that compared to, a different community at, say, a different university that isn't necessarily as diverse?
Great question again, Tanmay, and a really good sort of way to sort of come to a landing and take some questions. So there are, and you know one thing about me is that when I speak, I like to give people, how much time I'm going to take and the 3 points that I'm going to do. So 2 minutes and 3 points.
Sure.
The first thing that it has done for our community is, you look at a college, you look at a academic post-secondary institution, it is the life and soul of everything that is around it. So for a start, these international students who have chosen Durham College, be it our Oshawa or our Whitby campus, played a fundamental role in community building. The types of the diversity in the restaurants that have come up, the diversity in the types of people that have moved here, you immediately see that impact. We now have Osmos, we've got the local gyro store, we have a whole bunch of new South Asian stores, the halal market. So to begin with, our international students that have come here have driven a particular kind of community building philosophy. But there are 2 other things that they have done to us from a knowledge generation perspective. For a start, what a lot of these international students have done is they have brought a certain level of perspective to the table that companies are now looking at. You see, what happens when you're trying to build an economy or when you're trying to build a community based around tech, you need to look at talent. And when that talent has diversity embedded within its genes, it represents something for communities. Think about it, Tanmay, talent management is a skill in and of itself. I don't have it, you may, but I know I don't, because you go to school to learn these things. Because there's a reason companies say, we want a certain level of diversity. We want a certain level of ethnic blend. We want a certain level of linguistic changes in our teams because it brings new perspectives. So one of the things that it's done is that it's made our community and our city in Oshawa come to the attention of a lot of firms. That's why, you've seen these students being asked to lead the volunteer teams at CISO Forum, which you were at, if you remember that. Canadian Women in Cyber, Global Cyber Olympics, another example. It is because of these international students that these companies, MNP, PwC, whatever else have you, a company like CyberX puts in money because they see the value that those students bring. So number two, they brought attention of major corporations. Number three is when I mark their papers and I look at the kind of work that they do for me with industry and the products that they're producing and the prototypes they're producing, they are creating a certain culture of learning. Companies, when they come to the AI Hub or the Center for Cybersecurity, I can tell you many of them, very well accomplished CEOs, come in knowing how to spell artificial and spell intelligence, and spell cyber and spell security. But at week 8 of the project, they've suddenly come to the realization, hold on, 99% of everything that they're doing is based on data. And they have brought a conversation about AI to the table that I'm so grateful for, is that AI is an interdisciplinary concept. You need the sociologist there, you need the psychologist there, because the questions you ask is on the data that you produce is ultimately what you train your models on. Get that first step right, and everything else is a science and a magic that will take its own course. So for me, what we've just now done is brought up a new dimension and conversation in the world of AI and cybersecurity. And I think on our shirts, the signature identity that the AI Hub has is that not only do we have computer science students in our teams or DevOps students in our teams, we have marketing students, we have business development students, we have students in chemistry, and that for me is such a great tribute to the true intelligence that governs our world.
Now, what I love about what you just said, Ellie, is that, I started off by asking you about the sort of impact that international students have had on the community around Durham College, and you took it all the way from there to, how executives figure out the importance of data with cybersecurity and AI, and all the way back, and you put that all together, and that makes so much sense, and that's really, again, the kind of insight that I feel like is going to be truly very valuable. Now, before I go ahead and ask you for a closing message for our audience from your side, there are a couple of questions from the audience that I want to ask. And I want to start off, and this is not the exact question that was asked, but I'm going to go ahead and sort of paraphrase and tie it into something that we were talking about. You mentioned that it's important to bring industry and society and the actual problems that they face into the world of education to enable students to actually get that experiential learning in a way. Even if that's not totally the right word, I feel like that's on the right track. What are some examples of how you've been doing that?
Great point. So one of the philosophies that has governed my teaching practice and my pedagogy has been, if I teach about technology to my students in yesterday's way, I'm robbing them of tomorrow. Okay? I like to root them in the present. I like to root them in what is it that local companies or companies around us are facing. And the way I do it is in two predominant steps. The AI Hub has been structured in a way where we have the tech team, the team that does all of the work and the developments and the deployments of Professor Amit Maraj, Sam Plary, Dr. Anu, who's probably on YouTube, I saw her as well. Some example, Abhilash Marcharla, Sabah Siddiqui. These are folks who will lead the student teams. But then I also have people like Ruchi Rajkumar, Mauricio Cuellar. All of these folks help me with drawing attention to businesses. So what it's done for me is that as a professor, it's kind of made me into not just a teacher and a learner, but it's also made me into a bit of and I'm going to use the word, into a bit of a salesperson. And you need that ability. You need to know how to sell the knowledge that you have. It is commodified, and I don't want to get into the debate of capitalism and the influence of capitalism and education. We can on a separate occasion, but you need to know how to sell and package what the skills that you have. So what I've done here is that if you notice, the AI Hub social media or the Center for Cybersecurity social media is very strong. How we've attracted businesses is by playing on our brand, the Durham College brand, showing them how active we are, giving them customer experience that they wouldn't get anywhere else, but then by doing another thing, and that is hey, when you want to get a job, people tell you, hey, message that person, ask them for a coffee. We've been shameless at that. Whether it's Bruce Croxon from Round 13 Capital or Robert Herjavec from the Herjavec Group, we are shameless that way. Very politely and in full compliance, we will message them and say, hey, when you have the time, can you come and see us, students? 30 minutes only. Why don't you come out and meet with us, and we'll talk to you about what we do. And then when we talk to them about what we do, we also give them a way forward. You see, in Canada, we're blessed to have a public funding structure for research and innovation that is the best kept secret and needs to be revealed. There are opportunities with Ontario Centres of Excellence, with NSERC, with NRC, National Research Council, that we can tap on. So typically a company will put in 30% of the cost. We might get 70% from somewhere else, including in-kind. So the cost of R&D comes down. So you know how we're doing it? If you want me to close off, is through ROI, return on investment, but return on imagination as well.
Return on imagination. Wow, that's really, really fascinating to see how students are gaining that experience, which is both a return on your investment and their imagination. Thank you for sharing. All right, so now there are a couple, actually quite a few more questions. I do want to start off with one though, slightly different from what we've been talking about, but still related. So I'll go ahead and sort of get that to you. So this is a question from Tassin. He's asking, what kind of problem-solving skill should be present in the person studying or working with AI?
Very good question. So what type of problem-solving skills? I'm sure that psychologists and business experts, etc., will explain this in different ways. But I'll talk to you from the experience that I get working with my awesome students at Durham College. 3 different areas that I see their problem skills really translating and parlaying. The first is having a problem skill or having the ability to solve something that directly impacts the customer. All right? So the first piece of this is knowing your customer, or in tech speak, knowing the end user. Remember, I started off by talking about that idea that how do you make the end user familiar with the UX UI? I can unpack that moment when you learn your first levels of communications and different facets of DevOps, from how you do your testing to how you do your QA and all of that. But just take that piece. The first problem-solving skill is you need to know your end user. If you don't have the end user within your frame, you are taking a fundamental wrong step towards solving a particular problem. So know your end user. Number 2 is not only do you need to know your end user, you need to know that technology is rooted in PPT, people, process, technology. Farouk Nair, who is the chair of our advisory, always talks about this idea, people, process, technology. The problem skill that you need to have is not that, or do something that Ali doesn't say, hey, that was the line of code that was broken, the library needs to be updated, now that it's updated, boom. Now you're getting recommendations that Netflix is back to working, here's my service bill, $10,000, see you at your next downtime or whatever have you. No, when you are solving a problem, you need to think, okay, I identified that the libraries is an issue, and we updated the libraries, good on you, and it had missing values, excellent, you solved it, great. But now you have to think, what about how this is going to be maintained? And what's the process now to sustain that anytime this error happens, there should not be a downtime for 10 days, it should be a downtime for 10 seconds, and we can rectify. People, process, technology. If you are trying to solve something in technology and you are working in a vacuum, typically people who do that with me at the AI Hub, I literally walk them out the door because it is a collaborative effort and you need to know people, process, technology. And number 3, when it comes to problem solving skills, and I talk about this all the time, is that know what you do not know. Look, nowadays there are so many, and by problem solving, you're looking at a product, let's say a customer now in COVID-19, they want to figure out a way in which they can ship things faster without seeing someone face to face. Let's say that's the problem a flower shop is facing, etc. You know what, Tanmay, you and I both know nowadays, WordPress developers are like, whoa, I'm a web developer. Yeah, maybe, you know what, depends. But here's the thing, is that there's so much code out there that's been translated into what you see is what you get editors and these drag and drop features and widgets that, you need a brain and a really functional brain in order to make those things work and bring them together. Now, you also need to know what you don't know. And yes, it's great to bring in a whole merger of different plugins and make it all speak seamlessly to one another, but also know that there are some things that don't necessarily go hand in hand. So when you're not sure about something, flag it, because chances are somebody with another skill set can find that for you. That's why I always talk about the piece about community. So when you're approaching a problem, the problem solving skills I look for is know your customer, number one, know the process, and number three, know what you do not know. And if there's any firm out there that expects you to know everything, I guarantee you that firm does not have the kind of bandwidth you think it does and the longevity that you think it does. Because every firm needs to know its blind spots and grow and build upon that.
Being able to realize that you have those blind spots and being able to build around those, and even using them, and being able to sort of, I mean, as you mentioned, understand that they're a limitation. I feel like that is absolutely critical. And I mean, there are all sorts of physical analogies that we could give it, but really, I love what you mentioned around being able to know your customer, and make your decisions based off of that. So there is another question. There are actually two more that I want to ask immediately. And I want to start off with actually another question from Tassin, and he asks, I want to know, is it a good advice to switch to programming with a modern language like Go, or to stick with the programming languages we're using right now? I will hand that over to you in a second, Ellie, but one thing I will say really quickly from my experience is that of course, I code in a bunch of different languages, and each language is good for its own things, first of all, right? It's not like Go is a silver bullet for everything, or Swift is a silver bullet for everything. But what I would say is that just like how learning different natural languages gives you an idea of different human cultures and gives you different ways to view human problems, learning different programming languages gives you ideas of different computer or technology cultures, enabling you to look at algorithmic problems in different ways as well. I feel like the most evident way, the most sort of immediate way to objectify really that example is exactly with the Go language, whereas with something like Swift or C, traditionally a programmer thinks, spinning up a thread is expensive. Do we really want to implement concurrency for something? But then when you go with Go, you literally just type Go, and suddenly you've spawned a Go routine on a thread, and now things are running concurrently, right? So,
Yep.
and so just the simple fact that the language provides a different feature makes you think about problems in a whole different way. And I've experienced this myself. I'll be coding something in Go. I was actually coding something with my mentor Tim Duncan the other day, and instead of me thinking, maybe there are hundreds of thousands of phone numbers in this database, maybe I just want to send them, with 16 different threads on my machine instead of launching 100,000 different threads. But in Go, I just said, just type Go and it's all done. Just being able to look at the So I feel like towards the beginning of today's episode, Ali and I were talking about the importance of that equity in terms of everybody being able to access resources like the internet, and we just experienced exactly that. It was a small technical glitch, as Ali mentioned in the chat. Internet went out for a moment, but we're back. And as I was mentioning, essentially learning more programming languages enables you to generalize that problem-solving skill to different languages, enabling you to be a more generic programmer, someone who knows how to communicate with technology. But Ali, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very straightforward for me, right? Is that the more languages you know, the more versatility you bring to the table, the more diversity you bring to the table. Like the example you brought about Go, versus if you've been programming Go and then you've got some skills in Julia as well, when you're looking at a problem and you can look at it, and again, it goes back to what I said earlier on, right? Is when my students, when they're huddling with each other and I hear them talking in different languages, there's a reason to that, right? Different languages give you different tools and apparatuses to work with. So my straightforward answer to that is, look, yes, if you want to get into the world of machine learning, AI, and data sciences, there are your staple languages, Python being quintessential to that, right? Mm-hmm. But if you want to become more of a versatile and a diverse developer, absolutely. I always talk to my students about, what got you into the world of AI, and they'll say, we're studying computer science, and then we started hearing about AI, and thought, hey, it might be a good fit. It is a great fit because AI in and of itself has to be layered onto something. Mm-hmm. It has to live in an app-like technology. It has to live in some sort of interface. For that, you need other languages. Mm-hmm. So that's great. That's how you develop interoperability, right? So I believe that, as many languages as you can pick up, that's the fundamental basis upon which you can even start one day to write your own languages. You got to think a little bit, shoot for the moon, and if you miss, you may land on a star, right? Why not?
Absolutely. And what you mentioned about writing your own languages, that's something that really fascinates me. I feel like it's a good exercise for any programmer, really, eventually, to just write like a little toy compiler. They're not really as difficult to write as you would imagine. In fact, I would say the compilation is the easy part. The difficult part is parsing the code and generating like the abstract syntax trees. That's the more difficult part, because compiling code has some kind of logic to it, which parsing it takes a bit more effort because there are just so many permutations of things. But thanks for sharing, and you're absolutely right. I feel like being able to know these different languages gives you that versatile skill set that is really in demand today. Now I want to continue with a question from Tim Duncan. He says, do you also incorporate different learning styles into your equation, like visual or auditory or kinesthetic or reading or writing, like these sorts of learning styles?
Yep, absolutely. I can speak to that. So I was just also noticing Akash Gupta made a comment about jack of all and master of one is better in these times. And, I understand that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I will say this to Akash, is that the importance of knowing or having a diverse skill set is the perspective you need to be looking at this from now. The ability to realize that a lot of folks that you now see working in AI didn't necessarily start off in computer sciences. That ability of understanding diversity of skill set is more important than considering becoming a sole specialist on one area. And I'll leave that there. Now, to the question about diversity.
Really quickly, one thing that I want to mention, I think Akash Gupta actually agrees with you, because that's the second part of the phrase, jack of all trades but master of none, is oftentimes better than a master of one. So he agrees with you there, yep.
Great. So the other thing that you mentioned about diversity in the classroom in terms of different teaching methods. To begin with, I think the whole world of the reality that we face ourselves in now is, as I think you mentioned, ironically, you mentioned this in your last session, ironically, Corona has brought us closer to each other. Yeah. Because now we're getting to have these high-touch environments, albeit through digital interfaces. But I really need my fellow colleagues to understand something, and that is when you're teaching online, it doesn't mean that whatever you're doing in the classroom, now do it in front of a camera and do it across Zoom. Fundamentally, that is not the way it works. What I encourage a lot of teachers and professors to start thinking about is two different ways of some of the things that I've been looking at. Number one is go back to the basics of, what tools are we using for our learning? And those barriers that we've typically had, I don't know if I want to have a Slack group with my students, or I don't know if a WhatsApp group will be useful, etc. It's time to break those barriers. Mm-hmm. A lot of your students, they do a lot of their exchanges and a lot of their learning across WhatsApp. I've seen entire DevOps projects. Now, let's not get into the privacy piece of it. There are concerns there, but I've seen a lot of DevOps teams converse on timelines with one another really well across WhatsApp. People work at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. It works well for them. So number one is get comfortable with some of those tools that you typically were not using before. And if it is as simple as let's integrate WhatsApp into our curriculum, then so be it. Mm-hmm. If that works, then do it. Number two is what I found very, very useful right now is you can't just have standard, here I am, here's a professor, and I'm talking to you. There are a lot of video editing skills that you can use. Like, the simple thing that you did, which was the preamble to the session. You in the garden, giving me a call, all of that stuff. Make it fun and exciting. I implore teachers to realize that now more than ever, you need to be in that Shakespearean moment which tells you the world is your stage. You need to now perform. Teaching and learning, and as a professor, it's not just about the banking model of education that Paulo Freire talks about. It's about diversity. It's about production. You need to be a good performer as a professor. And now more than ever, you need to be able to do those things that can engage your students. That piece of coming into the classroom and say, here's the PowerPoint, here's what this does, here's what that does. Well, guess what? You're going to be called out on it now, more louder now than you were before.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for sharing. And now I actually want to, on a similar note, I want to ask you another question. Or actually, even before we get to that, really quickly, give me one moment. I'm just quickly taking a look. All right, so we have another question from Akash Gupta, actually. And I feel like this is on a similar note. What are your views on encouraging competitive programming for teaching problem solving? What are your thoughts on that?
This is another fantastic question. So, Akash, thank you for that. Let's look at it from this perspective, right? When you think about competitive programming, let's translate that into an example. You look at your hackathons, right? The word hackathon has kind of been overused to some degree and lost its pulse, but the essential ethos behind hackathon is, given the same tools, how would you solve a problem differently, okay? My concern with competitive programming, at least within a business environment, is that time, the statement, right? Time being money, right? It's a matter of how much time you can have to do that. The ability to do R&D, research and development, research and innovation, whilst operating your core business is not something that you can get into as a business from day one. Any business, all right, has to first make sure that it can keep its lights on. And whether that's through a significant seed investment of money or whether that's through sales, they need to make sure that their core operations can sustain the ability for them to sort of have this competitive environment and hackathon-like environment. I like the idea of competitive programming principally and theoretically. I'll tell you where I have a problem, and that is it practical for businesses that are just starting and that are at a point where they're struggling to keep their head above water? That's number one. Number two is I do like this idea of comparing competitive programming to problem solving because it brings diversity into the mix. What I like instead is to have teams where you encourage a culture of problem solving. And what I mean by that is you don't just always go to your tech team and say, hey, here's the problem the customer is facing, now solve it. You do different activities. This is why team building, this is why corporate exercises exist, to encourage different ways of thinking. So while I don't think competitive programming is very easy to sort of run in any business, it's a bit of a luxury that's acquired. The ability to have teams do different challenges, different exercises, different, like gym for the brain kind of activities, that is where I see problem solving being more useful and being more creative in the types of problems we give them.
Mm-hmm. Now, what you mentioned around creativity makes a lot of sense, and I feel like you touched upon what it means for businesses, but actually I want to take a step back because I think Akash Gupta is talking more about what your views on it are encouraging. What your views are on encouraging competitive programming to learn problem solving for students.
For students, well, here's again, the thing is that within these college environments, the universities environments, we already do a lot of this, especially here in Canada. So I mentioned the example of hackathons. We've had our students go to at least 8 hackathons before Corona.
Very nice.
So they have been going. We've had some great things happening in Whitby, etc. This is a culture that definitely exists strongly here. I think I appreciate having both hand in hand, those competitive programming like environments as well as the problem solving skills. I do feel there's more we can do with these competitive programming like scenarios and make these hackathons more relevant. And I like ideas where you see these hackathons sponsored by particular companies, and then they tie it to a particular goal, so that if you do come out as number 1 or number 2, you get a 3-month or a 4-month internship or something like that. the more we can encourage the programmatic piece of how we roll this out, the better it's going to become. But I agree that it's a great resource through which to train and build the next set of technology talent.
Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, you're right. There are lots of within Canada. I've seen this as well. Different competitive programming environments that are actually pretty great for learning problem solving. Although I will say it kind of depends on what your goals are and what those events goals are. Sometimes they don't really match, and sometimes it can be a little bit misleading. But when you find the right fit, it is great to learn problem solving. From there, let's see what other questions we have. We do have quite a few. I'm now going to ask you, let's see over here, just give me one more moment. What are other skills that are important for students within the field of technologies, is what I'm assuming, other than problem solving?
Other than problem solving. Technology at its fundamental roots, and one problem that I see with a lot of folks is it sort of gets them to think that there's only one way to do something, but there are multiple ways you can get something done. So if there were 3 other skills on the basis of that quote that I would recommend for students who are getting into the world of technology, 3 other skills that I would advise them to make themselves proficient in. Number 1, besides language that I've spoken about a great deal, I highly recommend having some sense and knowledge of what it means to run a business or an operation that has a financial implication. Why I say this is because in the world of technology, knowing what the difference is between a capital and an operating expense is fundamental to knowing whether the technology that you're building is sustainable. So I recommend for students that if you're going to get into the world of technology, understand the basics of business economics and business financials. Yes, I get it. Accounting and all of these things can be a little bit of a drag, especially if you're addicted to just coding and creating code and whatever have you. But you need to know these realities. I say this all the time to my students. If you think your brilliance in coding is going to take you to the next place in this universe, remember you are reliant on other people. No individual is an island in and of themselves, and you need government, you need businesses, you need accountants, you need marketing people to get that. So number 1, understand the fundamentals of budgeting and business economics. Number 2, which I think is not just an important skill, but is actually a make it or a break it for me when it comes to students in technology, is the ability to understand the marketing life cycle of technology. Okay? Just because you have a machine that screams doesn't mean that, wow, it's a machine that screams, doesn't mean that it's going to go out bonkers into the market. And I can talk about this separately at any point of time, and I say this cautiously, is a lot of the technologies that you're seeing today, a lot of theorists will tell you that these were developed 3 or 4 years ago, but they came out into the market now. Why? Because there's that moment of social engineering when you know the time is right and you launch it. You may have the next best thing after sliced bread, but knowing the market and knowing the pulse. You see, building online communities, building sales funnels is a matter of social engineering. And knowing that marketing mindset or appreciating it is fundamental. And number 3, from a tech skills perspective, that I feel a lot of students that come into computer devs or AI or data analysis courses, etc., one of the things that I feel that a lot of them lack is that appreciation for what we call business utility or business value. And what I mean by that is know that whatever you have created, all right, there is a certain life cycle that it goes through. There's a certain lifespan that it goes through. How do businesses ultimately determine where a particular technology can take them? When is the right time for them to sell it? When is the right time for them to continue to support it? You've got to keep all of those aspects in mind. So learning not just business economics and accounting, learning the marketing pieces as well, but also learning business utility and business value and how businesses grow themselves over a period of time is extremely essential.
Thank you very much for sharing, Ali. Now, I'm absolutely sure that our viewers have learned a lot of really crucial tech life skills from you today. Thank you very much for sharing. And I feel like specifically what you mentioned, like, for example, technology being ahead of its time, right? You got to make sure that things are launched and released and brought out to people and advertised in the right way at the right time. I feel like a great example of that is actually a plane, the Lockheed L1011 TriStar, which was a plane, back in the first flight was back in 1970. It was extremely advanced for its time. It could even land itself, but it wasn't really a successful project because it was too advanced for the time it was in, right? It simply was way too ahead of its time to exist. So thank you for sharing these crucial tech life skills with us. Once again, it was an honor to have you on the show. Thank you very much for sharing these insights. And before
I'd love to make a closing comment if you allow me to.
that's actually what I was just about to ask you to do. Thank you.
Sure. So as a closing comment, here's what I'll say. To everybody that's listening and watching is, I really appreciate how they tune in every week to listen to you. And I think they should, one important skill that they should take from you is access. And that is, look how with your skill sets, Tanmay, you've made yourself accessible to the community. And whether it's people from Dubai, from wherever asking you questions, you make yourself available. You may not respond right away, but you always make sure that you respond, if not directly, through a session that you do or something. So that's one of the humbling, humility-based skills that I really hope that a lot of listeners take into account, is that, some of the greatest thinkers always work with their doors open. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is fundamental to make you not just a good human being, but somebody who's really driven by the power of technology. Technology is the campfire around which we all tell our stories, and everybody belongs there. Everybody has a seat there. So let's make that seat happen in light of everything that we're seeing in the world today, people being excluded for all the wrong reasons. Let's make the room for them at the campfire. Let them tell their stories as well. And with great people like Tanmay and all of his followers, we can build some fantastic technology. Thank you, Tanmay, for having me. I really hope this was helpful.
Thank you very much, Ali. Now that I have the opportunity to speak, I must say thank you for sharing your thoughts. Again, it was really an honor to have you on. You really are my mentor, and I'm proud to say that the areas that you've touched upon, the sort of advice that you've given, your words truly they're beautiful. And so thank you for putting this together in such a thought-provoking, in such a creative manner that makes it so simple for everybody to understand. I feel like that's really important. It's taking these advanced concepts and being able to just put them in a way based off of real examples about how you're actually applying them in your practice. I feel like that is really important and enables us all to really learn about what's coming up next. So thank you very much for sharing. I'm sure that after listening to you, everybody has a lot more to think, a lot more to learn, and a lot more to apply in their work. And so once again, I really appreciate it. Now, one more thing that I do want to say before we go is thank you very much, of course, Ali, for joining, but everybody for joining the actual live stream. Thank you. And of course, this series, Tech Life Skills with Tanmay, is held every Sunday in the morning Eastern time. And so next week, we've got some really exciting content lined up. I do see a couple of questions about cybersecurity. Make sure you join next week because we will be talking about cybersecurity for enterprises, small businesses, and of course, you, the consumer. Now, apart from that, there is one thing that I'm really looking forward to. We're going to be touching upon lessons from a fighter pilot on decision making. So it's going to be super fun. I can't wait to see you there. Make sure you do subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, that way you know when we're actually streaming. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in today. Once again, it was an honor to have you on the show, Ali. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Goodbye, everybody.
Always welcome.
Thank you.